listened as though their life depended on it, made him want to give them everything he had. I think he would like to feel that in performing music, he presented it in the best and most convincing light. And if along the way it touched the hearts and mind, that would have been extraordinarily important to him.
For our second half-hour on Chance, Mr. Glenn Gould returns to Ideas by special request with a rebroadcast of his first program for us, Improvisation in Music. In the fall of 1966, Ideas broadcast a series called The Perceiving Self, a study of subjectivity, perception, and creativity. Glenn Gould's study of improvisation as his contribution to that series includes insights into chance music as one type of improvisation. Here, then, is the internationally acclaimed performer, critic, and writer Glenn Gould with his 1966 program for Ideas on improvisation.
Some years ago, a friend of mine who was then at medical school had been reading about experiments in action painting and in chance music, and one night, having nothing better to do, he decided to sit down and compose his own chance action poem. He decided that since this was to be a very contemporary work, it must straddle that fine line between deliberation and chance, and that therefore, however arbitrarily, it must acknowledge a system. The system he decided upon was the selection of every 11th word from the editorial page of his evening newspaper, and he kept selecting these words until he had enough of them to furnish a 14-line sonnet. In matters of form, he was old-fashioned. Now, as it happened, the editorial page that day was heavily weighted with foreign comment, and the poem, as it emerged, took on a quite unique quality of international awareness. When it was finished, the author pruned certain lines where the metrical balance seemed rather casual, and with that done, turned to his most important creative responsibility, choosing the title. He was sufficiently au courant to realize that the most influential works of this kind have in common titles which are entirely unrelated to their contents, and he also knew that even in works with a decidedly aleatoric approach, the title must convey some very solid and concrete idea, such as to suggest that despite the radical techniques incorporated in the poem, their author harbors a genuine social concern. Well, at that time, he could not think of any more solid title than the name of the man who was then President of the United States. My friend was an American, Mr. Harry Truman. So he called the poem simply Harry Truman, filed it, and forgot it. But at this point, the plot thickens. The class wag in his school year heard about this poem, decided to get hold of a copy and mail it to the president, along with the author's return address. And so several weeks later, the mailman brought a letter on White House stationery, written by the secretary to the president and containing some highly complimentary remarks. The president wishes to extend his thanks for the splendid poem which you forwarded to him, and to tell you how very happy it makes him to know that young people, such as yourself, are finally able to appreciate just what he is trying to do. Well, it seems to me that the moral of this story, which is, I swear to you, absolutely true, touches upon a process central to our ability to form judgments about a work of art. Most of us tend to look for signs of premeditation, even when we're dealing with works in which the creative operation has been carried out without any sort of planning or forethought. When we listen to a musical composition for the first time, we try to convince ourselves that we're not simply involved in an errant sensual experience. We want to believe that however formless the work may seem, it is surely the product of a deliberate intelligence, and if formless, then is so at least because the author intended it that way. We can't bear to think of ourselves as the dupes of an aimless and indiscriminate mind. We need to feel assured that what is being said has to be said, and that our time in attending it is gainfully employed. At times, it's a question of guiding our perceptions by wishful thinking, of encouraging, if necessary, a false perception in order to achieve an aesthetic kick. If President Truman did in fact read that poem, he may well have accepted it as a glowing testimonial to his statesmanship, and if so, he was obviously able to convince himself that behind its seemingly elusive rhetoric, a deliberate creative intelligence was, however deviously, at work. In a way, it's the old and quite unanswerable question of whether or not a lumberman wielding his axe upon a block of wood and carving out by accident the likeness of a man of whose existence he does not know has created a work of art. Most of us would prefer not to know how casually the blow was struck. These questions take on a further dimension when we analyze a musical experience, because music has the frustrating habit of proving in the end to have been about nothing in particular. It allows a great latitude for indulgence to its author and to its listener, and we sometimes are tempted to objectify the musical experience in a manner that would never occur to us when dealing, for instance, with the written word. For if by comparison we find in the daily paper a story defaced by typographical errors, blurred by ink splotches, and distorted by makeup editors' cuts, we can still manage to piece together a reasonably comprehensive account of the item concerned simply by making connections which our experience with language and with human motivation conveys to us as reasonable. We know that, given time, the reporter and his editor would have hoped to make it a coherent account, and it doesn't upset us unduly if we must allow that their deadline was hard upon them before this could come to pass. It's even possible for us to derive a certain amusement from paragraphs where the syntax is as elusive as used to be the case in the press conferences of, now let me say this, Dwight Eisenhower. And the reason is simple enough. Like those Sunday painters who confess to not knowing much about art, but to knowing nonetheless what they like, so it is with the written word. We all improvise with it continuously. We're all of us on terms with the artist, which, if you think about it, was Nikita Khrushchev's problem in a nutshell. But it's not easy for the layman to enjoy that camaraderie with the musical profession. For ever since the Renaissance, the explosion of instrumental styles in music has obliterated for all practical purposes whatever chant forms and folk modalities once served to cement a relationship between audience and artist. And consequently, the laity have long been convinced that the making of music is a game regulated by such arcane devices that they couldn't be expected to understand in any event. What they do expect is that the composer must know the score, as a plumber knows sewage systems, must know it not as an intuitive experience, but as a thoroughly reasoned argument, even if the probes and cavils of that argument are not apparent to them, and that whatever extemporaneous elements are involved must be subjected to the laws of musical rhetoric. It's an attitude that bears special watching today because this is the age of the debatable motive, of concern with whether and to what degree our thoughts and our works derive from a conscious industry or result from concealed and unacknowledged desires. Now then, how much deliberation would you say was involved in this musical example? Now, before I identify that, how about this one? The first excerpt was from the piano pieces Opus 11 by Arnold Schoenberg, and however chaotic it may have seemed on a first hearing, it was the work of an artist whose method comes as close at times to total deliberation as that of any musician since the early Renaissance isorhythmicists. Yet if one listens to that example casually, it suggests an almost entirely haphazard harmonic, melodic, and rhythmic selection. For though Schoenberg's later reputation was made by adhering tirelessly to a resourcefully expanded supertheme called the 12-tone row, that example from one of his exploratory earlier pieces was concerned primarily with minimizing, or at times avoiding altogether, the conventional repetitive relationships which most classical music asserts. In doing this, he made, in a sense, a method out of the avoidance of other methods, a cliché out of the avoidance of clichés. The second example was an exercise performed by students of Cirencester School in the north of England, improvised by them, in fact, after a suggestion by their rather permissive music instructor, the British composer Peter Maxwell Davies. Listening to those children, one can hear many of the clichés which form the basis of our post-tonal language, the language of Schoenberg and his successors, but which, as clichés, a sophisticated composer like Schoenberg would endeavor to avoid. And the relative clarity and the obviously repetitive method of that improvised piece could easily and ironically seem the end result of a quite deliberate choice mechanism. So the relationship between an organized and a spontaneous structure depends, first of all, on those preconceptions which we bring to our analysis of them. And as the comparison between Schoenberg's work and that of the Cirencester School students suggests, an improvisation is not necessarily a work which gets by with a minimum of formal coherence. There are such works, and we'll discuss some of them later, but the more intriguing aspect of improvisation is the way in which it derives from and relates to the disciplines of a notated context. After all, the primary difference between music made up on the spur of the moment and music carefully and conscientiously written down is not in the nature of the materials used, but rather that under the duress of the improvisatory situation, a musician can't possibly be as thoughtful and as perceptive about the choice and disposition of his material. For when improvising, or even when dealing with hastily written down pieces, one simply has no time to exercise with patience and through many drafts carefully worked out contrapuntal inventions. No one has ever been able to do that, not even J.S. Bach. In the musical offering, his massive treatise on a theme supplied him by Frederick the Great, Bach opens the work with a three-voice fugue, or ricercare as he calls it on this occasion, apparently similar in manner to one which he improvised at Frederick's court and in the king's presence, and with which he acknowledged his dissatisfaction by later dedicating the entire work as an apologia. Here it is in its second written-down version, and as though Bach were more interested in recapturing the mood of that courtly occasion rather than in salvaging his reputation for contrapuntal extravaganzas, it's still rather disjointed and episodic, still lacking a firm sense of direction, still fundamentally improvisatory in design. Having put his theme through many canons and a four-movement sonata, Bach, at the end of the work, tries it again as a fugue subject, and this time creates a monumental six-voice setting in which the security and tautness of the counterpoint are miraculous, and which not even he could have improvised. If the improvised fugue can never compete as a technical achievement with the carefully contoured written one, it's not because it lacks academic pretension. The contrapuntal devices may not entirely succeed, but an improvisation drawn upon any academic model will inevitably, even ostentatiously, mimic the criteria of its notated cousin. And there are many such criteria. Here's just one of them.
bet you when he wrote this one, he was thinking of something else.
Victor Borge, improvising his way through one inescapable cliché of Baroque style, the "this could go on forever and probably will" diatonic sequence. Sequences like that, which are identical repetitions of a phrase with only the pitch altered, are able to circumnavigate the chief relations of the home tonality almost indefinitely. They're among the most useful crutches for the improviser whose inspiration is temporarily curtailed. They serve him much as an automatic pilot serves an aviator. They won't get you down to the field or up over the weather, but they will at least keep you going until you can think of something to do. Borge's sequence was a very broad spoof of a sequential tradition which appears again and again in Baroque music, even in highly organized forms like the fugue. And it wasn't only minor masters of the Baroque who made use of such episodes. Even Bach, in his early years, often did, and the presence of such sequences in many of his instrumental fugues reminds us of the high improvisatory quotient in his first style. Bach, after all, was an indefatigable improviser, and here in the fugue from his E minor toccata, it shows. These devices are, of course, in themselves anti-architectural, because nothing about them is either problematical or central to the work. They may indeed perpetuate a fragment from one of the primary motivic strands of the piece, but they don't clarify it or increase our knowledge of it. They're devised primarily to kill time. Here's Mozart parlaying two similar sequences into a full page in one of his fantasias, a type of composition which owed its nomadic disposition directly to the improvisatory habit. These clichés almost inevitably have their theoretical roots in the practice of a preceding generation, where they functioned as the solution to what was then a pressing structural problem. In the case of Bach's toccata sequence, the composer was making use of the sort of diatonic depth-finding which was common in the latter half of the 17th century and which helped to stabilize the harmony of early tonal music. The sequence in Mozart's Fantasia would fit comfortably within the tonal spectrum of a composer a generation before his time, one of Bach's sons, perhaps. This chronological aspect is not unrelated to Marshall McLuhan's observation that the subject matter of one technology is the art form of the next. In this case, we could say that the discipline of one generation becomes the improvisatory substance of the next. And for that reason, these mechanical props which an improvisatorily inclined composer borrows from academic tradition not only enable him to avoid doing his compositional homework, but also inform us about the tradition to which he belongs and about the frequency of such devices in it. Like Freudian slips, these clichés tell us a great deal about the composer's background and about the musicians who influenced him or whose influence he endeavored to evade. Beethoven is a case in point. His career is not only dead center in the chronology of these last 3 centuries of instrument-based music, but in addition he embodies, for some people anyway, a transition in musical manner, in composing attitude, so to speak, between what are usually referred to as the classical and the romantic styles. But the interesting thing about Beethoven is not that his early work exclusively observes some severe architectural discipline called the classical style, and his later work becomes involved with that fantastical, quasi-improvisatory, psychologically ambivalent manner called romantic, but that in much of his music the two attitudes tend to coexist. A good example of just such coexistence is the first movement of his sonata opus 31, number 2, the Tempest Sonata so-called, with its turbulence, its riotous chromaticism, its peculiar hesitancies, its vague, only half-focused recitatives, which have a sort of inkblot test relationship to the rest of the movement. They relate if you want them to. In most quasi-improvised music, the melodic materials are chosen to minimize mechanical problems rather than to impose new and unpredictable intervallic situations. Hence, scale passages, arpeggiated figures, and a generous supply of ornaments are the improviser's melodic stock in trade. Materials of this sort predominate in improvisatory formats, whether the extemporaneous flights of jazzmen, the showtime amalgams of cocktail pianists, the cadenza tradition in concerto playing, or a few years back those coy fantasias on themes submitted by the bald-headed gentleman in the third row aisle, or the lady with the feather in the gallery with which Alec Templeton or Grace Castagnetta finished off their act. It's this rather lackadaisical approach to problems of structure which prompts the familiar caricature of the improvisatory tradition. It's undoubtedly the inspiration for those pre-Raphaelite paintings which show us a heaven-storming virtuoso agonizing before his instrument in a twilit bric-a-brac-filled garret, the reproductions of which turn up nowadays on Austrian cookie tins or as cosmetic ads in the New Yorker magazine. But this melodic thrashing about is by no means exclusively a 19th century tradition. In Bach's day, we find that kind of improvising in the recitative, especially in the instrumental recitative, which he was fond of incorporating into many of his early compositions. This sort of improvising is essentially a performer's rather than a composer's prerogative. It relies upon the invention of agreeable melodies, rich but not really complicated textures, and a heavy overlay of sentimentality, the latter designed so as to conceal by dramatic initiatives the lack of carefully worked-out developmental ideas. A good 19th century example is found in the second movement of Richard Strauss' Violin Sonata, which movement, by no coincidence whatever, bears the subtitle Improvisation. In his tone poem, Ein Heldenleben, Strauss superimposes upon fragments of his main theme an obstreperous, flirtatious, and mock-improvised violin solo for a scene in this musical autobiography dealing appropriately enough with the seduction of the beloved. One might expect that the predominant trends of the present, serialism and electronic music, would rule out improvisation as a viable practice. But for some musicians, this has not been the case. For the American composer Lucas Foss, improvisation became a method by which to investigate the potential of what was to him an unfamiliar musical language. It became, in fact, a Geiger counter with which to find the load of his future. Until about 7 years ago, Foss was pretty generally regarded by his colleagues as a hidebound conservative. Today, he's thought of as one of the more adventurous, even avant-garde composers, and the transition which made this rather unsettling about-face possible was accomplished during a 5-year span in which he organized an improvisation ensemble consisting of piano, cello, clarinet, and a generous supply of percussion instruments. Their charter specified an operation within a contemporary aesthetic without relying upon any sort of standard notation, and while subjecting themselves to the same kind of split-second interreaction that Baroque harpsichordists built into their continuo playing. Here's a sample. One is tempted to say, paraphrasing Robert Frost, who likened free verse to playing tennis without a net, that the harmonic stakes in this kind of improvising are not really very high. If one challenged those same instrumentalists to concoct without prior consultation amongst themselves a simple fugetta in the style of Telemann and in the key of C major, one would have a clearer notion as to whether such multiple improvising is sanctioned solely by the permissive climate of contemporary harmonic practice, or whether telepathy and intuition do indeed play a part in the result. In any case, in searching for his own future, Lucas Foss examined through improvisation the clichés of the immediate pointillist past, and from that investigation went on directly to write a work for voice and orchestra called Time Cycle, perhaps the most unique attempt at stylistic synthesis to have been produced in this generation. I suspect that the therapeutic aspect of improvisation has in fact served many earlier composers as well. Within every creative person there is an inventor at odds with a museum curator, and most of the startling things that happen in music are the result of some momentary gain by one at the expense of the other. The free-form extension which improvisation implicitly commends supplements and lends perspective to the controlled compositional experience which underlies musical theory. It brings one back to an encounter with certain primeval tenets of the idea of music. It reminds one that the will to communicate is antecedent to the urge to formulate communication, that for the composer, even as for the listener, there are limits to immediate comprehension, to a complete understanding of the why of his process, and that very deficiency augurs a certain tolerance in their relationship. Above all, it suggests to us the importance of distinguishing between sentiments inspired by genuine reaction and impression, and those aroused by the need to react and to feel impressed. And in offering that remarkably humbling experience to the jaded sophisticate, improvisation performs perhaps its most important function. In any case, for Harry Truman's sake, let's hope so.
Glenn Gould, with a rebroadcast of his first program for Ideas on improvisation. Next Monday, Mr. Gould will provide us with a fresh-minted 1968 study of chance music. Until then, this is your host for Ideas, Ken Haslam. Good night.